Welcome to the St Emlyn's podcast. I'm Ian Beardsell.
And I'm Simon Carley.
And we are at the Basics Conference in Leicestershire at the Sketchley Grange, and delighted to have with us Phil Lucas, who gave a talk earlier today about ejector seats and sequelae thereof. My knowledge only comes from watching Top Gun in 1986. So we will learn much more from Phil in the next few minutes. But Phil, perhaps before we get into all that, you could just give us a quick introduction about yourself, how you've ended up here today, your career, your background, and what else you do when you're not at a conference like this.
Thank you very much for speaking to me, and nice to chat to you. Yes, so I am in the Royal Air Force. I am working at the Royal Air Force Centre of Aerospace Medicine, and our job is working with aircrew and doctors in the field of aerospace medicine, particularly when it comes to military aircraft. And at the Centre of Aerospace Medicine, we perform a huge amount of roles and tasks, a lot of it around education and teaching. It's about the equipment that aircrew wear and carry with them when they're flying. It's also looking into human factors issues. Overall, it's dealing with a point where the human being interacts with the aircraft system itself. If you think about it, the aviation environment is actually a very alien environment. It's not a natural place for people to be. And although we take air travel for granted, whenever even you're getting into your own aircraft, there are a whole load of life support systems which are there keeping you going. Things like extra air, so pressurization, to make sure that you are flying in a cabin which is not too high up in altitude terms from the ground. You're also experiencing the effects of jet lag or fatigue. And that can affect your performance as well, especially when it comes to you flying the aircraft rather than you being a passenger. And then also, when you are flying, you're noticing the effects of the G-forces. So you're accelerating down the runway. You'll notice that when the aircraft descends, you feel a little bit lighter. When it goes up, you feel yourself slightly pushed down in your seats. And so when it comes to military aviation, and also when using performance aircraft, what you find is those forces are so much more important. The effects of things like fatigue, and also even what we call spatial disorientation as well. So when pilots fly into cloud, we need to teach them how to trust their instruments and not actually to trust their sense of balance, which can play tricks on you when you don't have any visual references. So suddenly in aviation, you've got a lot more things to think about. And so our Centre of Aerospace Medicine is somewhere where we are able to learn about the theory and teach and just inform aircrew and doctors alike.
So a lot of that is about optimizing performance. And we've talked a lot on our podcast about optimizing performance, both in terms of the human factors, in terms of the equipment. And we've also talked a lot, haven't we, Ian, about when things don't go terribly well. And it'd be fair to say that a focus of your talk today was around when things have not gone well, because it was largely about ejection from an aircraft. And I think most people were familiar with the vague concept of the ejector seat. We actually started off by telling us just how important that's been in the history of aviation and how successful ejection technology has been in saving human lives.
The ejection seat's been a remarkable innovation, and a lot of people will know the company. It's Martin Baker. It's a British company which developed the ejection seat and has, through a model of continuous improvement over the years, has saved so many lives. In fact, as of today, 7,800 lives have been saved through Martin Baker ejection seats, which is quite remarkable.
That's amazing. Is it true they still do that at Thai?
Yes, they do. They do. And they also keep a record of every single ejectee they have as well. They're very proud of it at their factory.
That's fantastic, because that's actually learning through the system. And you talked a lot about the development of the seats over the years. But I think the other thing, obviously, we talk a lot in terms of trauma in road traffic accidents about the kinetics of what happens, about the injury mechanisms. There's a brilliant explanation about how the process goes from when you pull the lever on the aircraft to eject from the aircraft. There's a whole series of events that take place in a vanishingly small piece of time, all of which is affecting the participant. And it made me really think about the kinetics I see in car accidents, but much more focused here around the ejection seat. Can you tell us what that looks like?
So the ejection seat is there to be able to get the pilot out, as you said, very quickly. But also you need to be able to do it with sufficient force to make sure that they're clear of the aircraft, that you can do that at any altitude, that you could do that at any sort of angle of bank as well. So it doesn't matter which way the aircraft is pointing, but also speed as well is very important. You could find that the pilot is going from a nice cozy cockpit where everything is warm and they're in their own atmosphere, to suddenly they're pulling the handle and then they're ejected into whatever force is. If you're at altitude, you could suddenly be into a 500 knot slipstream. You could be 25,000 feet above the ground. You could be in pitch dark if it's nighttime as well. And that ejection seat basically has to carry the individual safe and sound back to the ground. And that comes with a lot of technology, as you say. And it starts with getting them out there quickly, because you might not necessarily have the luxury of being 25,000 feet where you're a long way from land. You could be just a second or two from collision, and then that's got to get you out quick.
Yeah, and you showed a video of, I think it was a Canadian F-18, doing a low, slow flyby at an air show, and it went wrong. You talked a lot about decision-making. How much time did you think the pilot may have to make the decision to eject?
Yes, absolutely. The human factors behind decision-making is really important. And that was a good example of it was all okay, and then very suddenly the aircraft departed. And that cognition to go from everything is entirely normal, so what is almost certainly the first ejection of their career, the pilot has recognised it's gone wrong, realised the situation is irrecoverable, made the decision to leave what is a very expensive aircraft in the middle of an air show, and doing so, he saved his own life. And that decision to pull the handle psychologically is a big hurdle sometimes to have to take.
It's interesting. I mean, how do you train for that decision-making?
A lot of simulation, a lot of thinking about it. And it's a really good example with aircrew of thinking about possible scenarios, rehearsing it in your head. Yes, all right, I need to go right now. But the worst decision is not ejecting in time. And there's been too many pilots for which that sadly happened.
As you're talking, there are a lot of parallels that I can see with what we do in a resus room or a pre-hospital environment about making decisions and the training we have to do. And that idea of using the brain as a training simulator. So I've done one resuscitative hysterotomy in my career. I've been part of it, but I will talk that through in my brain constantly a couple of times a month to make sure I'm ready. Is that one of the techniques you would actively teach your pilots to keep up to date with this rather than having to go to a simulator every 6 months to do it?
Yeah, in actual fact, the simulator opportunities for aircrew are a lot more frequent. So they will be constantly thinking about that as well. But there is a large element of being mentally ready. And I think you're in trouble if you think this can't happen to me. There's that classic invulnerability aspect which one needs to avoid. And as I said earlier, the aviation environment, although we think it's routine because we made it routine through technology, in actual fact is a harsh environment full of hazards. And so therefore you have to be there with your decision making to decide if the worst comes to the worst, I've got to get out, and I particularly got to get out in time.
The human elements are so important. But the other part in your talk, which I found fascinating, was just the biomechanics of this. Because the forces that could be involved in this are incredible. You've got this soft, squidgy human attached to this thing which is doing 500 miles an hour, and then you're thrown out into a different atmosphere. You can potentially be hit with a huge amount of force strapped to a seat. Just take us through that. The sequence is you pull a handle, you have to get out, the canopy goes off in some way, shape or form, either get blown off, or there's cord within the canopy which blows it apart. And then the seat's projected out, or is it rocketed out of the aircraft?
First of all, what we need is a clear path out of the aircraft. So the canopy has to go. Either the entire canopy is jettisoned, or the canopy is fragmented through a detonation cord. And then what happens at the same time, the pilots are being pulled back into the seat through strength systems. So the straps get them into the best possible position to be able to cope with the ejection. And so as they're pulled back at the same time, the seat then begins to move upwards very quickly. As the seat moves up, it effectively moves up on a gun, as it were, and it's then moved on almost on a telescopic stick straight upwards and then put clear of the aircraft itself. At the very minute the seat is clear of the cockpit, then you have a rocket motor fire, which then takes it well clear of the aircraft in a position where it won't collide with the aircraft. And at that point, then you can begin to separate from the seat itself.
And I thought you showed a really beautiful sequence of pictures of a test firing of one of the seats, something I never realised before, because I always imagined that the rockets would be underneath the seat firing upwards. But of course, you're often trying to avoid a tail on the aircraft coming to hit you from behind. And so the rockets actually direct you forwards and upwards to try and get you out of the tail. And you can see how that sort of technology has improved over the years and the development of how things have gone. That was really interesting. So the rockets are now firing, you're going up into the sky, you're strapped in. You mentioned that some of the modern seats now actually draw your arms and your legs in as well to stop them flailing around, to stop you getting limb injuries. Really amazing type stuff. So you're now up in the air, you're in the seat. What happens next?
Yeah, so you're clear of the aircraft, thank goodness, and you are still in the seat. What you have to do is separate from the seat. However, your seat also has life support systems, and if you're thousands of feet up, the last thing you want to do is to be separating from your seat and then suddenly find yourself dangling from a parachute at 20,000 feet in the air, for example. You're not going to last that long in that thin an atmosphere. What happens is if you are too high, you do have an emergency oxygen system, but that's strapped to the seat. So the seat amazingly keeps you with them until you get below a certain altitude. What altitude that is depends, of course, on the height of the ground beneath you, but you can set that. But typically around 10,000 feet, if you're above that, you'll find yourself descending very rapidly in the seat, which I think is probably the most terrifying ride you could ever have, is trying to trust the seat as to that it'll actually release you at the time. And of course it does. Once it gets to that height, 10,000 or so, then you have the separation of the individual from the seat. If you're below 10,000 feet, that seat and the human being actually separates very quickly, as you can imagine. And then as soon as the seat and the human separate from each other, the parachute, it trails out, that catches in the slipstream, unfurls, and down you come to ground.
So just to get that in my head correct, if you went out at 25,000 feet, the parachute doesn't open, you descend in. Oh, crikey. Yeah. I think that is a scary ride.
That would be an awesome ride to have.
It would, wouldn't it? Yeah. I'm not going to do that. I went down a bobsleigh once. That was bad enough. I'm not doing that. That's incredible. And then obviously you've got to land in the parachute. So where's the potential for injury during this ejection sequence?
Yes, so there are a number of injuries, and this is really why I've been talking at this conference, is to just inform a little bit on potential injury patterns. Now, the good news is that an ejection within the envelope, and what I mean by the envelope is that you are the right height, the right speed, the right angle of bank, which the ejection seat is designed to be able to work effectively. Your injury rate is very low. However, it could be that this is a last split-second ejection decision. You could be at the wrong angle. You could just be unfortunate. The likelihood of injuries gets higher. So the classic are long bone fractures due to flail for the arm getting caught in the slipstream, but the technology is there to draw the limbs in and to be able to bring them to a place where they won't come out with the slipstream. In high speeds, the neck might get pulled around the side of the head box, and that could cause neck strain or cervical injuries. Again, there's ways to mitigate that also. And then, of course, the thing which we can't really do much about is the ground. And these parachutes are designed to save a life. And of course, the pilot can't always tell where they're going to land. And if you're going out to sea and you're ejecting over the sea, hopefully at least you've got a soft landing, but you've again got a dinghy to deal with. And that should be okay. But if you land on the earth, let's hope that the ground below you is flat. However, it could be uneven. You could find yourself drifting into trees, drifting into buildings, or you could be in high winds. And if you've got, say, 20, 30 knot wind and you're hitting the ground, then you get dragged quite a long way. There's a lot of opportunities in this ride to have injuries, though most of the time you'll be okay.
Many years ago, I was at Fairford in 2013. Where there were two MiG-29s crashed. And I think I'm right at the time, that both of those pilots had spinal injuries. And my impression was that there was a very high rate of spinal compression injuries when you eject. But you tell me that's not the case anymore.
Spinal compression injuries is the classic injury you think about in ejection seats. And that was certainly the case with the older seats. But now what's happened, the improvement in the technology, is that the firing sequence has been, or the acceleration has been made more even over distance, which has meant that although there is considerable spinal compression, as a result, it's sub-fracture threshold. And so they think that the spinal injury rate has gone down from, say, 30% or so, which you'd have had, say, 20 years ago, down and probably in the order of 3 to 5%.
Just thinking about it, the Russian planes probably didn't have a Martin Baker seat in them, did they? If this was to happen in my neck of the woods, which is entirely possible, we have military aircraft flying through our area, and I see a patient, they are a pilot, do I need to suspect spinal injury? Do I need to take them anywhere special? Are there any investigations in the ED that I would need to do if this patient's brought in to me?
What we say is we do want people treated as a spinal case. Assume the worst here, because you don't know the aircraft type, you don't necessarily know the parameters by which they ejected. The pilot could be walking around, and that's fine, but then what you need to do is just encourage them to sit down, and they know that the medical services want them to be lying still. And so what we do is to treat them as a spinal case. Also get them to help you remove their equipment if they can. It's much easier than cutting it off, because there's plenty of things within their kits which you need to be careful of when you're removing it. So the best thing to do is just say, look, can you help us take your helmet off, your mask, your life preserver, and all that sort of thing. If they can't, then you're just going to have to get access the best you can. But what happens then is when you take them off to the hospital, you will very quickly have support from the aviation medicine services to provide specialist support to the hospital. So we find out very quickly where they're going, and we'll be in touch with the ED, looking specifically at what investigations we're needing to be able to clear a spinal fracture. And we're very specific over what we ask for in terms of imaging investigation before we're happy that the patient is cleared.
So we've talked about the moment to get to pulling the handle and hopefully safely getting back to ground. What psychological support does somebody need after they've made that decision, assuming they make it to ground safely? Is this something that people can brush off and get over, a bit like a resuscitation that's gone wrong? Or is it something that needs a lot more longer-term care, a bit like sometimes a resuscitation that's gone wrong?
Oh, that's a very good question. And I think that comes back to individual response and the circumstances of the ejection. I'm sure for some aircrew, you can brush it off, and part of it will be the nature of what happened, and they'll be okay. There'll be others, particularly if it was a difficult crash, there may have been other people who are hurt, and it may be in a circumstance where they are particularly thinking to themselves, oh no, I'm not too happy of my performance on there, in which case the recovery may take a lot longer. So the important thing with this is that each person is treated as an individual, that we look after them, and particularly as the medical services, what we do is make sure that they as an individual are okay, and that we're part of the support in the decision when they think they're best to return to flying. But it's very much be centred around the individual themselves. We do know that psychologically, a crash which someone walk away from, that's absolutely brilliant. But for the first month or so, do you know what? Their support will be there, because they'll have family, they'll have friends, they'll have the squadron, they have the organisation. Everyone will be around them supporting them. That'll be fine. They almost argue that they might not need much psychological support at all. And I'm not saying that everyone needs psychological support. It's what we tend to run to. But that, as I say, some people might need it, others people might not. However, the time to really see how people are in the months afterwards, probably 4, 5, 6 months. And it's at that point where people have really had time to sleep on it and think about themselves over and over again. And the key emotions, and this really does come around to pre-hospital care and also dealing with families, dealing with ourselves when things go wrong, is making sure that no one is bearing feelings of guilt or shame as a result of what may have happened. And that's the nub of where support has to be.
I did reference it earlier. Obviously, my second favourite film is Top Gun. My first favourite film is Top Gun Maverick. There is a famous line in the original Top Gun where the commanding officer says about Tom Cruise, get him back in the air, as if somehow that will fix things and make everything better. And I think sometimes we have that in a resus room, or when we've looked after a patient, just get them back on the ambulance, get them back at the next patient. Do you have a standard set of criteria to get somebody back to flying, or a way in which you can decide if somebody's ready for that? Or is it led by the individual, or some form of combination of the two?
Yeah, in reality, it's a combination of the two. It's definitely individual led. Certainly, there are a number of investigations of the human factors side, and there will be a number of people who will be part of that decision making. And for some of them, get them back in the air might be it. But a lot of it also depends on circumstance, where we are or what they're doing flying wise. And get them back in the air is almost certainly not give them the aircraft and send them off solo. They'll certainly be there with some supervision. That might be, rather like medicine, a treatment pathway one can try, and if it doesn't work, we try another thing. But above all, this is centred around the individual and what they feel is the right thing. rather than decided by others.
This is fascinating to think about what could happen if you eject, but also fascinating for us is the idea of a portfolio career. And I know a lot of emergency physicians are always looking for something, another string to their bow, another interest they could have. You're obviously full-time in the RAF, Phil, doing aviation medicine. Can you just tell us a bit about aviation medicine as a career, how you came into that? And is this something that people could look into to have as an interest alongside a career like emergency medicine?
No, absolutely. I'm a medical officer in the Royal Air Force and I'm a GP. And that's opened me up within my career to a huge amount of opportunities over a number of different areas. And aviation medicine is naturally one of them. Every GP within the military who works with aircraft or air crew undergoes some basic aviation medicine training. And then we have some advanced specialists who undertake a diploma in aviation medicine, and that is a 6-month course at King's College in London. And that's an internationally recognised gold standard of aviation medicine training. Aviation and space medicine in itself is a subspecialty which is recognised by the GMC. It was recognised back in, I think it was 2006. And you can separately train in that. And that's not what I do. I'm not an aviation space medicine specialist. It's a very small and select cadre which works in places like the CAA and in the RAF. But as a GP, by doing the diploma in aviation medicine and then working on stations and working in the centre of aerospace medicine, what I have the opportunity to do is to combine both my GP, my primary care practice, with aviation medicine. It puts you into so many fascinating areas. There's a heavy occupational focus to it because we are thinking about aircrew and what is fit to fly, what isn't fit to fly. We deal with human factors. We teach aircrew, and for example, I know how to control and run the centrifuge. So we have a high G centrifuge, an entirely different subject, where I'll sit at the controls, and there's a few of us as GPs, and we all coach the pilots how to resist the forces of high G. We have a hypobaric chamber, which we will put the pilots in, and we'll have ourselves in there as well, supporting them. So there's an amazing amount of different things you can do within aviation medicine, and it's just one part of what can be a fascinating RAF career.
So if you want to do aviation and space medicine as a full-time career, it's one of the Royal College of Physicians specialities. It's under the RCP. And there are 4 ways into it. You can either go in from general practice, anaesthetics, internal medicine, or sadly, ACCS, but only if you've done acute medicine. No, I think that should change. Do we know anybody who could change that?
I don't know. I think you have some influence at the college, don't you, Simon? Maybe it's time to have a word. Or a late career change for one of us. Phil, thank you so much for your time. I think there's so many parallels. We've probably exhausted the whole being a doctor's like being a pilot analogy. But actually, in the last few minutes, I've realised that in some ways it is a little bit. And thank you again for talking to us about what is a completely fascinating subject and one that, unless you go to conferences like this, you'd never really get to explore. You've been very kind to share your experience and your time with us. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Lovely to chat to you.